when you use this device, you get this very clear activation that everyone who's used it has felt. This maximal activation, at times it feels greater than maximal, and that people feel very fatigued, right? It's a different sensation than voluntary exercise, I think, in fatigue that we feel.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Sam Buckner, who is a PhD professor at the University of South Florida and the director of the USF Muscle Laboratory. Dr. Buckner got his bachelor's degree from Temple University, master's from Florida Atlantic, and then he did his PhD at the University of Mississippi. He's been teaching at USF for the last 3 or 4 years, running his laboratory there as an assistant professor in exercise science. And his research, you'll come to find out why we're so excited to have him on the show, because his research is focused on skeletal muscle adaptation, on how to use low load training to build strength and muscle, and also on the relationship between muscle strength and muscle size. He's gotten over 60 papers published, so he's really a prolific and excellent scientist. And on an interesting note, when I met him in person, I was very impressed by his handstand push-up skills. And at one point, he actually held the Guinness World Record for the most consecutive 90-degree push-ups as well. Do you still hold the record, Dr. Buckner?
I no longer do. I lost it when I was working on my PhD.
Yes. The sacrifices we make along the way, right?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk with you and be able to dive into some of your research and also talk about some of the research we're doing together on the Newbie.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So there's a lot of different things I want to cover before we get into some of our studies and different things. Could you, for the benefit of our listeners, could you give just maybe a couple minute overview on muscle hypertrophy, what it actually means to grow muscle, and what the most important contributing factors are in muscle hypertrophy?
Certainly. So I've done a lot of work studying muscle hypertrophy, and it's one of the areas that interests me most. And a lot of people will enter the gym and the goal will be muscle growth. They want to hypertrophy their muscles. And what that means, as a scientist or a researcher, what I'm looking for when I say hypertrophy is typically an increase in the contractile component of skeletal muscle. However, you don't always know that's what's increasing. We have other components within the muscle as well. But basically, if we think about the organization of muscle, we have our entire muscle belly, which is what we see when we look at ourselves. We see a muscle. That muscle is made out of fascicles, and a fascicle is basically bundles of muscle fibers, right? So we've heard of a muscle fiber before. So a muscle fiber is a skeletal muscle cell. And that skeletal muscle cell, that fiber, is made out of something called myofibrils. It's basically levels of organization. And that myofibril is made out of something called a sarcomere. And a sarcomere is basically scaffolding proteins and then contractile proteins. And those contractile proteins are called actin and myosin, right? So actin and myosin basically interact with one another and basically pull each other closer together, which causes shortening. So it happens at this most intricate level. Now, what we believe happens when we hypertrophy is that we add additional sarcomeres to muscle fibers. So remember, sarcomeres make up myofibrils, a bunch of sarcomeres, and those myofibrils make up the fibers themselves, and a bunch of fibers make up muscle. So we're adding these proteins to our muscle in series and in parallel, depending on what study you read. And over time, we accumulate enough to be able to pick these up with different imaging techniques. right? And the technique we use in my lab, I use B-mode ultrasound. Actually, I have my ultrasound behind me today. And we're able to look at the muscle bone interface and the muscle fat interface up at the top of the image. Actually, this is a picture of my bite. I don't know why I keep it on my wall next to me, but we can see in this picture, and this is an old ultrasound, but we can see the bone here, the bottom of the image. And at the top, we can see the muscle fat interface. So we'll measure that distance over time. I don't know how well that's coming off on the screen.
If you're just listening on audio here, he's showing us an ultrasound picture, and we can see some bone, some muscle, some fat, and he's looking at a measurement, basically a vertical measurement of some of these dimensions to measure the muscle size.
Yeah. So we'll measure muscle thickness at multiple points across the muscle belly, because we do know that when we train, muscle growth is not homogeneous. So it's not the same from the top to bottom of the muscle. It may grow differently across the muscle belly. And when we're training to induce muscle hypertrophy or growth, there's several ways we can go about it. And in the literature to date, I think most researchers agree that intensities or loads around 30%, as low as 20 to 30% of 1RM, and as high as 70, 80, 85. Some studies make muscle growth happen with 90% of 1RM. This wide range of training loads seems to induce growth. And why do these training loads induce growth? The speculated mechanisms behind growth currently are mechanical contributions and metabolic contributions. And what that means, when you pick up a dumbbell, that dumbbell is a mechanical signal, right? Your muscles activate and sense that load, and that load tells your muscles to grow, right? Through turning on the fibers. The fibers have to be turned on, they have to be activated to lift the weight. So that's a mechanical component. We also believe we have a metabolic component. And what that means is when you contract your muscle, right, the production of ATP, which is the energy currency of our cells, when we contract muscle, we produce metabolic byproducts. The one most people are familiar with is lactate production, hydrogen ions. Basically, when we create energy, we get byproducts. And those accumulate within muscle cells and cause muscle cells to fatigue. And when muscle cells fatigue, we have to activate more, right, to continue to exercise. So the simplest example, if I lift a heavy weight, and let's pretend I have 5 motor units, and a motor unit would be one organization of muscle. It's an alpha motor neuron and the fibers it innervates. So you have to activate a certain amount of fibers to lift a certain weight, right? So a heavy weight takes a lot of fibers, a lightweight doesn't take a lot of fibers. When you lift that heavy weight, the mechanical component makes you activate all of those fibers. If you lift a lightweight, the mechanical component makes you only lift, let's say, 1/4 of those fibers are activated, right? However, if you do enough reps, the fibers you're turning on are going to become fatigued through metabolites, right? And you're going to have to turn on additional fibers. So the endpoint's the same. We activate all of the fibers associated with that movement and fatigue them sufficiently. And I think most people would suggest, and there is some disagreement here, but ultimately, if growth is what you're trying to achieve, you need fatigue, right? So fatigue the fibers. And if you lift heavyweight, you can fatigue the fibers in 8 to 12 reps. If you lift lightweight, you might need 20 to 30 reps. But you reach that same endpoint, which is eventually turning on all of the fibers involved in that movement, activating them, right, and stimulating a signal. We have signaling proteins within our fibers that get turned on when the fibers are activated. And they tell that fiber to grow, right, to stimulate something called muscle protein synthesis, to synthesize new fibers or new proteins associated with our myofibers. And our myofiber, again, made out of sarcomeres, which are made out of actin and myosin and various other proteins. If you want me to add one more layer to that, Garrett, I can just bring in the sarcoplasm, but I might be going too deep for our first intro question.
Let's do one more layer. Let's do one more layer.
Okay, so this is just kind of the emerging new controversy, and this actually, it can tie right into muscle size and strength as well if we want to go there. But the newest discussions around muscle growth are in this idea of differentiating between something called myofibular growth and sarcoplasmic growth. And a lot of individuals chasing growth think that, okay, we might be stimulating, depending on how we train, we might be stimulating something called sarcoplasmic growth, or we might be stimulating something called myofibular. Now, myofibular growth is the growth that most people believe contributes to strength, because myofibular would be proteins associated with a myofiber. And if we remember, myofibers make muscle fibers, right? Which contribute force. So they're the contractile apparatus of muscle. The sarcoplasm is basically everything surrounding those muscle fibers, right? The organelles that support, they store calcium, right? It's basically the area surrounding the fiber. And there's been one study that came out that showed that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy was disproportional to myofibular hypertrophy when you did really high volume training, right? And that made people go, huh, that's why bodybuilders are sometimes disproportionately strong for how big their muscles are, because the sarcoplasmic component, in theory, would be less contractile and more, I guess, just supportive for the muscle itself. But the data we have on that currently is not really strong. We have one study they took a subset of their data and analyzed that subset to come to those conclusions. But I tend to think, and I think most experts tend to think, that when you stimulate growth, you have an increase in both the myofibular, the contractile component, and the sarcoplasmic component, which is basically everything else in that cell. They seem to increase typically in proportion as we train. But one of the reasons that was a tempting hypothesis, and I think it still is because we're constantly trying to explain why in research, I think, and in practice, we see instances where people grow, but don't necessarily get stronger. And it becomes this discussion of, is there something called functional hypertrophy and non-functional hypertrophy? Meaning, is sometimes growth contributing to our strength and to our function, and sometimes is it not? And that's a loaded question, of course. And I suppose it depends on what view of muscle growth that we're going to subscribe to. And there's a lot of debate amongst experts currently.
So at one end, it seems like when you train to that fatigued state, you get both sarcoplasmic and myofibular hypertrophy. What if you're a Olympic lifter or a power lifter and you're training singles and doubles? You're only doing, 1 or 2 or 3 reps at a time, taking plenty of rest.
Yeah.
Is that and you're trying to limit muscle growth so you can stay in your weight class. So are those types of athletes, is there evidence that shows that they're getting more myofibular hypertrophy and less sarcoplasmic, and it's more of that, like you said, quote unquote functional? Or is that just kind of a theory that hasn't been proven?
It's a theory that hasn't been proven, and it's only been done in one study. And it was hypertrophy style training they were using, just really, really high volume. But I think it was artifact. I think that study had like remarkable damage and inflammation, and I think it was interpreted as like disproportional sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. My hunch is that hypertrophy is going to happen where we increase the amount of myofibular protein, and we also increase the amount of sarcoplasmic protein to support those structures. Because the sarcoplasmic component of our muscle supports the myofibular, right? We have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which stores calcium. That calcium would be captured in the sarcoplasmic component, but it releases calcium so it can bind to the myofibular component so our muscle can contract. So I think it just makes sense that they would work together and increase in a similar fashion. It's going to be interesting to see what the research eventually reveals. But I think in the example you gave, they were training with a high level of specificity, right? The movements that they need to perform in their sport. And I think, that's probably the best way to train, to not prioritize growth when they need to focus on their weight class, but prioritize that skill acquisition and getting as efficient as they can in that movement and taking advantage of various neural adaptations that are likely going to take place to enhance their strength.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. And then
Yeah.
at the other end of the extreme, if we're talking about people who are, like you said, who are going into the gym because they want to build muscle and they are interested in hypertrophy, that's their goal, that's their priority. So we heard from you that in training, you have to reach that end point, whether you're using 30% or 80% of your 1 rep max, you got to reach that end point of fatigue and build up those metabolites and trigger protein synthesis. And then and then muscle growth happens during that protein synthesis phase, right? During the recovery period. And what are the biggest drivers of that? We need to have proteins and raw materials, is it insulin or other hormones or growth factors? What are the biggest things that move the needle on muscle protein synthesis? What are the kind of the biggest requirements that we need to have metabolically and otherwise?
I mean, yeah, we need protein availability. And I'm not in the area of protein. I'm a reader. I'm an occasional reader in the protein research, where we know that you obviously, the diet needs to be there if we're going to support growth of our muscles. I do think a lot of that literature, and this is probably a topic for a different day, I think the protein literature exaggerates the amount of protein we need, and not the literature as a whole, but a lot of emerging recommendations are like pushing this more and more and more protein. And I don't think anything is going to just continue to have a dose response, for its ability to induce growth. And as far as hormones, I'll try not to overstep my area of expertise, but I will speak on the hormone hypothesis, which was really, I suppose, relevant in the early days of resistance training. We recommended always lifting heavy for growth because lifting heavy stimulates a much greater hormonal change than lifting lightweight, right? So if you lift really light weights, you don't have this large increase in testosterone from pre to post exercise, this acute change, testosterone and growth hormone. But you do see that when you lift 70% of 1RM for 4 sets to failure. And for a long time, we thought that acute shift in hormones was causative for growth and adaptation. And I think now most people would agree that short transient increase, and it's elevated. I don't know how long, it's back down to baseline hours after exercise. That doesn't seem to be playing a large role for the muscle growth adaptation. It's more so the activation of these just protein cascades, right? So whether it's the I don't think metabolites are direct stimulators for growth. Metabolites are indirect stimulators for growth because they just allow us to activate more muscle, right? If you turn on a motor unit because you only need one to lift that weight, well, if the weight's so light that you only need one motor unit, that's a motor unit you'd probably typically use for aerobic exercise. Does that make sense? Because aerobic muscle is designed more so for very light, non-intense activities. But if you are able to bring yourself to the point of failure, you fatigue those ones out and you turn on motor units that are associated with lifting heavy, even though you're not lifting heavy. And those motor units, once they're activated, right, there's some activation of a protein signaling molecule. It's called mTOR. And a lot of people are familiar with the mTOR complex. We stimulate this protein, and this protein activates protein synthesis within the fiber. And this seems to be what's important. So through some type of metabolic signal or mechanical signal, right, we're able to activate a protein cascade through various signaling proteins. It's called the signal transduction hypothesis, right? So we activate a protein, and this protein has downstream proteins that it turns on. And the end result is we're stimulating protein synthesis. And when we have enough protein synthesis occurring, we add contractile components to our muscle. And over time, eventually, we've added enough that we have maybe a noticeable visual difference. We can see it, right? But after you train, you've stimulated that response, and muscle protein synthesis will be elevated for several hours, right? But you train and you come back the next day, no one's going to say, I grew a lot from that session I did yesterday, right? What they'll say is, I feel like I really stimulated my muscle, right? You told it to grow. And whatever its capacity to grow over a 24-hour period, that's what's occurred. But it's going to take several of those sessions to accrue enough of that growth for it to be meaningful.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Newbie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
That makes sense. I really appreciate that overview, and that makes a lot of sense overall here. I'm really interested in getting into some of this difference between strength and growth. But let's talk first while we're on the topic of hypertrophy. And we realize now that the goal is to reach this endpoint of inducing some fatigue, building up these metabolites. We know that that's your synthesis. We know that some anabolic hormones, are helpful in the process. Fair summary of what you said so far?
Yeah, I think so.
And so in your research, you've been looking at ways to induce hypertrophy to reach that endpoint of inducing some fatigue with little to no external resistance. So that's a two-part question. So can you talk a little bit about the work you've done? And then let's talk a little bit about some of the research that you're doing now with the Newbie along those same lines, using the Newbie to get that type of muscle recruitment with the hypothesis that it may be able to induce growth. So we'll start first with a little bit of your research background and how you've been able to evaluate that hypothesis of can you induce muscle hypertrophy with little to no external load.
Yeah. So I guess I started my research career in 2015, somewhere around there, and I've done quite a bit of work using blood flow restriction. So restricting your blood flow during exercise while utilizing low loads. So lightweight with restricted blood flow. And what does this do to skeletal muscle? So we did several studies over the past 4 or 5 years looking at low load alternatives. And essentially what we find when we use blood flow restriction is that the combination of lifting, when you lift lightweight, and a lot of people probably experience this, one of the complaints that you might see is, well, you just have to do so many repetitions, right? So a lot of times the the frustration of lifting lightweight is the fact that you might be in the gym for a very long time if you're doing something effective, right? So we said that the contributors for growth, we need some level of fatigue. And I will clarify, when I say fatigue, my recommendation is typically to failure or near failure. So you don't have to go to absolute failure. I always tell people that's an insurance policy, but it's not absolutely necessary. But anyway, we know that doing low loads can be very time consuming. So blood flow restriction is a technique where you add a cuff to the top of the arms or legs and you restrict the blood flow into the muscle, right? And at the same time, you limit venous return. So blood's going into your arm, right? But blood is having a really hard time leaving your arm, right? So you're lifting that same really light dumbbell, but now you're not clearing metabolites, right? They're stuck. And when metabolites get stuck, they induce fatigue, right? So you create this scenario where your arm is not recovering, right? You're doing bicep curls, for example, and there's this burning sensation. It doesn't feel good. Metabolites are bathing that muscle essentially. And maybe with, let's just say, a 20-pound dumbbell, you used to be able to do 40 reps. Well, with BFR, because we took advantage of metabolites, right? The metabolic induced fatigue, instead of doing 40 reps, we can now only do, let's say, 20 or 18 reps. We've reduced the volume of work we have to do to reach the same endpoint. So in a lot of ways, the kind of what I think of my research is finding different ways to reach this same endpoint. And this endpoint is, let's activate the muscle, let's fatigue the muscle, and let's see if in response to this, it grows. So we took that a step further, I suppose. And one of my colleagues, Brittany Counts, it was her thesis. We wanted to remove the external load completely, right? So we know we can lift lightweight. What if we lift no weight? Can we still make a muscle grow? So we actually coined this no load training. And essentially what it was is going through a range of motion for a bicep curl and doing 4 sets of 20 repetitions, right? But what if you were to do no load training, you no longer have an external cue to tell you, okay, I need to contract this much to overcome this load. There's no load to overcome. So, excuse me. Instead, what we said was maximally contract your bicep, right? So we just had people flex as hard as they could up and down, right? And it turns out that's actually not easy to do. But what it does do is it maximally activates the muscle, right? And it still is relatively fatiguing, right? And it's all internally focused, right? Meaning you're focusing internally on the muscle's tension as opposed to focusing on a weight in your hand. Now, I don't recommend this training strategy for anybody. I think it's really hard because psychologically, I think it's a bit more taxing, but it demonstrated something I think it's important. It demonstrated that growth is not at all load dependent, right? It's dependent on creating this signal and creating this activation, right? And this could be a pretty smooth transition. If you think about NeuFit.
Well, let me ask you before we make, as much as I love the smooth segue, let me just ask you a question there. So is that fair to say, to call that quote unquote no load training? Because if you're really the bicep is overcoming mechanical tension, mechanical resistance of the tricep of the, there's the antagonist musculature there. So there is some resistance. How do you factor that into the conversation here? How do you look at that resistance of the musculature?
So technically it's no external load training. And, there's been research, I would call this research pretty similar. They didn't find a huge difference, but they had people lift dumbbells. I think it was dumbbells. I don't remember exactly, but they would tell them to either focus on lifting the weight or focus on squeezing your muscle as hard as you can. And the group that focused internally as opposed to externally had larger growth over the study period, which was 8 or 12 weeks. So internal focus in this case was more effective than external focus. And what I would say is that if you're focusing internally, you're probably producing more force than you need to overcome that weight, right? And I would say with no load training, you're still producing probably more force than you would need to overcome. I don't even know what weight we could place in the hand to be the same level of contraction, right? So mechanistically, what does that tell us? It's the internal tension, right, between the actin and myosin, that seems to be what's important for creating the signal, and it can happen independent of an external load. And why might that be important? I I think people get in the mindset that you have to lift heavy if you want growth to occur, right? And there's areas where we do not know everything yet. I did a podcast recently and we talked about muscle density because I know a lot of the bodybuilding community thinks that lifting heavy is important for muscle density, right? I don't have any data right now to really answer that question, just some speculation. But we know that we can lift lightweight, we can lift heavyweight, we can lift no weight technically. And as long as we're activating, right, internally those fibers, growth is possible. And typically in these studies, we compare the growth that occurs to the gold standard. And the gold standard for, as long as I'm familiar with the literature, is 70% on 1RM, 3 or 4 sets to failure, right? Or 8 or 12 repetitions per set. That's kind of the traditional comparison group that we compare these things against. So the no load training was compared against traditional high load training. And a lot of these low load alternatives of BFR have been compared against traditional high load training. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's interesting. To me, I see it almost as three groups. One is traditional resistance. One is, very low load where you're using BFR for the metabolites. And then one is like you said, the internal focus is creating a similar mechanical tension as the higher load, but doing it internally rather than with that external weight as the stimulus. Is that kind of fair to break it up into those three?
Yeah, I definitely think so because the no load would not comfortably fit in either. When we could add a fourth, if you add BFR to no load, I think no load becomes a lot easier because now you can create metabolites within that muscle as well. And we did a study. It was no load training with and without BFR. And the idea was and a lot of people haven't had access to a gym lately. Putting a cuff on, inflating that cuff and doing some contractions, you probably have to focus less on maximally contracting if you can accumulate some metabolites. So, I mean, for the purposes of our discussion, I think 3 categories are fine. But then within those, you can maybe move the meter. Well, let me add more metabolites to this type of training, right? Let me decrease metabolites here. Let me increase or decrease the external load component here. Or let me increase or decrease the internal focus on any given type of training. So yeah, I think all of those are really beneficial and things we can take advantage of.
Okay, so we know the variables. These are all ways to get to our end point of inducing fatigue and metabolites within the muscle. And just to be clear, so everyone kind of understands the bigger picture, when we're talking about wanting to do low or no load training, a big part of that is because of rehabilitation or wanting to reduce the risks of injury or re-injury, right? Those are some of the main driving factors here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The clinical implications that's where this has the most impact. It's in living here in Tampa, there's a very fitness industry culture and they're more interested in bodybuilding, powerlifting applications, but where it has the most bang for its buck is clinical populations or people recovering from injuries that they can't bear a heavy external load. So it's nice that we have effective alternatives to lifting heavy weight. Yeah.
And for people who want to train, but even if they're not injured, or maybe they have some aches and pains, but they just want something that's more sustainable to be able to do some days with less strain on their joints, right, and reduce the risks of injury.
Yeah, just avoid contraindications.
Yeah.
And I think another one we don't even think of is, there's a blood pressure response to lifting heavy weight. And I think about this one less, but when I teach cardiovascular physiology every year, I'm reminded that during a double leg press, your blood pressure could get up to 400 millimeters of mercury at its peak, right? The highest blood pressures I've ever seen in the literature, and I won't pretend I've exhaustively searched the literature, but lifting weights creates a blood pressure spike. So it's not like you have 400 millimeters for 30 minutes, but for a brief moment, you spike your blood pressure up very high because you increase peripheral resistance, that resistance from your legs contracting, right? And pushing blood upward. So there's other reasons too why people would want to avoid heavy weight outside of musculoskeletal. There's cardiovascular implications as well, where you could perhaps get the benefits of hypertrophy, right, without the risks of heavy weight.
That's awesome. And especially when I hear that, one, it's a fabulous point, and two, I can't help but think that in an aging population, for people who you cannot lift as heavy, because of those cardiovascular reasons, to be able to maintain muscle mass and get all the health and longevity benefits. I mean, there is, to my understanding, pretty well established significant research that shows maintaining muscle mass as we age helps reduce all-cause mortality, helps improve quality of life, is a big goal that we should all have if we want to age gracefully, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Preservation.
that's a great point. So now let's take that segue into the newbie here. So you talked about blood flow restriction, build up metabolites, helping us reach this endpoint, kind of accelerate the rate at which we're reaching this endpoint of fatigue and metabolites. How do you think the newbie fits into this framework that we've described here around hypertrophy?
Yeah, so this one's interesting. And I'm excited to see what we find, because it too is a bit unique, and it might most closely resemble some type of hybrid between the no load, right? Because I think you almost mimic this intense internal focus, right? But without the psychological aspect of having to do that voluntarily. So a maximal contraction is not always easy to produce. So I think there could be some value in removing that component, right? Which might provide a means to get a fairly intense training session without the perceived exertion. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's probably a different kind of hard as opposed to normal training. And it's very easy, for example, when I say do 4 sets of 20 and contract as hard as you can, set 1 effort is probably here. Set 2, it's here. Set 3, it's here, right? And you encourage them, maybe they maintain it. It's hard to maintain activation because it's psychologically taxing. So I think in those ways, this has the potential to be a similar stimulus as this maximal contraction, but without that extra strain of it being voluntary. The metabolite profile, I'm interested, and I'm curious, and this is where we're looking at the fatigue response to this protocol, right? So we're bringing individuals through a training session, and we're going to see how their fatigue, right? And the one of the best ways to measure fatigue is an acute drop in performance, right? So if you can produce a certain amount of force and then you can't produce that same amount, we would assume that you can't produce that because you are fatigued. So indirectly, that data might tell us a little bit about the metabolic response to a training session with a device. But regardless of whether it's fatiguing or not, it's very interesting. If it is fatiguing, it's interesting that we achieve this fatigue with this device. And if it's not fatiguing, then we have a low effort, low fatigue methodology that may induce growth. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm interested in what we find, and scientifically we could find one or the other, and it's nothing more than interesting at this point until we get the long-term data with the actual growth. Um, I think there's a lot of potential here, and if we do consider the mechanisms that we propose, which are activation and turning on of these fibers, right? When you use this device, you get this very clear activation that everyone who's used it has felt this maximal activation. At times, it feels greater than maximal, and that people feel very fatigued, right? It's a different sensation than voluntary exercise, I think, in fatigue that we feel. So I'm curious as to what that looks like over time. We've also, we're tracking some different psychological things regarding effort, discomfort, these sorts of things. And then we're also looking at muscle soreness in the days following exercise, right? And when we discussed hypertrophy, I didn't put muscle damage as a mechanism, which some researchers do. I think muscle damage can be present in hypertrophic protocols, but it's not necessary, right? So it's just an interesting observation to see, is there or isn't there a damaging response? And the presence or not presence of damage doesn't guarantee things one way or another. It's simply interesting physiologically, because if there is damage, then this would look more similar to a high intensity, high load training program. If there's no damage, it's going to look more similar to a low load training program, if that makes sense, as far as the stress on the fibers themselves.
So is just for clarification, there is when you have soreness, does that mean there's been damage? Are those two absolutely equivalent, or are they related but not always one-to-one corresponding?
Yeah, they're related, but not always. So just because you're sore does not mean you have damage. And just because you have damage doesn't mean you have soreness. The best indicator of damage, like the best indirect marker, and this is, I think probably one of the most reliable ways, is just a depression in your torque production. So we measure isometric strength, have you pull at one angle, and if you come back the next day and you can only pull 80% of what you pulled the previous day, then that's a pretty good indication that there's some level of damage and that you're limiting your force producing capabilities. So when we do a damage profile, we do multiple different proxies. So we look at swelling in the muscle, we look at torque decrements, and we look at soreness all together, to try to give us this picture of what's happening in the muscle. So we'll have all that data to kind of bring together and consider together in determining, okay, what is the 24, 48-hour response to this type of training? But everything we need for growth is here. And I think, I think I guess before I jump ahead, I think we're beginning to understand inflammation and damage a bit more, in that damage was classically considered something that they called Z-line streaming. So the Z-lines are these structural components of the sarcomere. And after damaging these Z-lines, which would have proteins running perpendicular, right? They would be like misshapen. They'd be like, not in line, right? That was called Z-line streaming. That was classic muscle damage. But we know that there's this delay, right? We can have this delay in the response, which I think has to do more with inflammation following the exercise than actual structural damage during the exercise. So it's possible that inflammation is playing a role in soreness as we remodel the muscle and those sorts of things.
It's cool to know that there's still a lot that we don't know. There's still a lot to learn.
Yeah.
And even just on some of these relatively simple, not common everyday topics.
Yeah.
So right now we're just talking generally about some of the research approach and some of the questions we're asking. You have completed data collection on the first study, and we're going to save that for another time once it's been analyzed and published and everything. But the first study that your lab is doing with the Newbie is looking at some of those torque production, soreness, psychological profiles, measures of fatigue, muscle swelling using the ultrasound. So some of those things that you've talked about. Can you just talk about the plan for the second study?
Yeah. The second study, the plan, and we should be geared up to start this really, really soon, is just do a training study, right? So over an 8-week period, see how much growth we can induce in a resistance trained population. Because we had some discussions, and I think this is a great population to really put the device to the test of its ability to induce growth. And if the acute data, and we'll have a better idea once we look at the acute data, but the acute basically informs the long term and helps us understand what we see in the long-term growth study. So we're basically going to have people come in, they're going to do knee extensions, and we're going to compare head to head. Like I said, we do in a lot of these studies, we compare the NeuFit stimulus to a traditional heavy training program, right? And we see how do these compare across time. And I think the 70% consider the gold standard. That's not to say that sometimes things can't exceed this gold standard. It's typically a close race. But I think it's going to be a pretty fun study. We have so much interest here because everyone wants to use this device, and that makes my job as a researcher quite easy. But yeah, we're going to bring them in, do baseline muscle thickness, multiple muscle sites in the lower body, within subject design. So one leg's going to do NeuFit training, the other's going to do the high load heavy training, and we're going to see what we can achieve. And yeah, I think one thing that people, it's easy to be critical of research, and we tried to pick the design we thought would best answer our question. And this within subject design gives us a lot of control, because if you think about it, when you're training, sometimes we worry about protein intake, right? Which we talked about earlier. Well, within subject, the right leg and left leg had the same protein over 8 weeks, right? The difference was what was their training for their knee extension exercise over that 8-week period. And you could pick any indicator that could create a difference between, your groups. Within subject designs help with that quite a bit. So you have the same person's genetics, the same, some people respond to training and others don't. So you have a responder for the right and left leg, except now the right and left leg are getting 2 different stimuli. What does that growth look like over time? So we'll do muscle imaging, and if growth occurs, we're going to see it. And yeah, that's the goal. We want to see what is the muscle growth response to this type of training, and how does it compare to traditional high load training.
That's awesome. I'm so excited to be able to work with you and to see these studies evolve and see the data and hear your analysis of it. And can we have you back on to discuss the studies when the data is out and they're ready to be published?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I'm happy to come back on and talk. And yeah, I know a lot of people are using this device and they've had great success. So I know people are anxious to see the data, and I'm excited that we're conducting these studies. And yeah, I can't wait to share what we find.
Awesome. Well, really, it's a true honor for us to be able to work with such a wonderful and curious and knowledgeable scientist and your team there. And we're really grateful to have you come on the show. So thank you for sharing some of that knowledge and your perspective and experience. If people want to look up any more about you or your research, what's the best place to find you? Is it website, social media?
I'm not super active, but I am on social media. It's just Samuel Buckner on Instagram, I suppose. I have a Google Scholar page. So just Samuel Buckner is my Google Scholar profile. And that's where people can find my research if they want to read my specific research. Other than that, if someone has like a question related to what I do, I could take that question on Instagram, or you can email me at my just my school email, slbuckner@usf.edu. And if it's a research related question to something I've published or some of this type of information, I'm happy to answer it when I get the time. So yeah.
Very, very gracious of you. Thank you, Dr. Buckner. Really appreciate you coming on the show, and we're excited to continue to work with you and have you on again in the future.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.